Hello, my fellow Americans. This is Doug Leatherbury, President of the not-for-profit corporation, the New American Democratic Republic, LLC, a not-for-profit corporation, DBA, New American Democratic Republic. My son, Clarence, and I just returned from a fact-finding trip to Switzerland in Europe. We wanted to get right on the ground and get some of the facts about Switzerland. It has been over 500 years since Switzerland sent any of their citizens into war. They've remained neutral. Here they are in the middle of Europe, and for 500 years they've remained neutral and not been involved in any war. In the meantime, the United States is something like 4,000 miles across the Atlantic Ocean from Europe and Asia and Africa, if you go east. And we've been in one war after another since we've been founded. I'll explain that a little bit in more detail. We actually been on these foreign wars since after the Civil War, after the beginning with the First World War until now. Switzerland has a national policy of neutrality. They do not get involved in wars. They're smarter than that. They're more independent than that. And they've kept Switzerland out of war. The people there are real nice. We visited a lot of people and talked to quite a few people there, and the hotels and the stores we went to, and the mayor of Vivi and so forth. And they're all very friendly. They're very much like the people of the United States. I can't see much difference myself. They act just like they're from Indiana. How did we get involved in all these wars? Well, George Washington, when he gave his farewell address in 1797, his intent was to keep us from the United States from being entangled in foreign wars. He set out our national policy of non-involvement in foreign wars. And that policy continued from his administration, from his days in office, until President Wilson went into office in the early 20th century. President Wilson was probably the first global oligarch to achieve high public office in the United States. And whether he did not know what our national policy was, or simply did not care, but one reason or another, he was very anxious to get us into the First World War. I had the numbers how many people we lost in the First World War. We had over 350,000 casualties in the First World War. We had 53,000 deaths in the First World War. And I doubt if one person in 1,000 who could tell you what the justification was for us to get in the First World War. There was none. We had none. But there we were, spending our lives and our treasure in the First World War. Think of all the Americans that would be alive today, descendants of those 53,000 soldiers, men and women who died in the First World War. Think what difference our country would be. And if we'd been a mediator for peace and prosperity and liberty and justice, as George Washington wanted us to be, we could have avoided that First World War probably. It would have been nothing more than a little fracas. Think what we could have done had we been neutral and a mediator for peace rather than an advocate for war. Well, we know what happened after the First World War. It led directly into the Second World War. Think of it, Second World War. How did the Second World War start? Well, it was a conflict between the evil Nazis of Germany and the evil communists of the Soviet Union. They were in a battle for control of totalitarianism and control of Europe and control of who knows what. Had we been a mediator for peace rather than getting in the war on one side or the other, we joined the Soviet Union in that war. And while we were fighting for the Soviet Union in that war, they were infiltrating the United States, putting all the communists they could in our government, infiltrating the whole of the United States, the Congress, the administrative government of the presidency, and so forth. And we can see evidence of that throughout our history during and after the Second World War. I won't go into that. But it's despicable what they did and what we let them get away with. We should not have been in the Second World War. And think of what, just like the First World War, had we been a mediator for peace, think of the Americans that would be happy today because their father, their brother, their son did not get killed in the Second World War. All of our American families lost people in the Second World War. And every now and then I go to some cemetery and see some of my relatives who lost their lives in the Second World War, just as all other families do. I admired President Roosevelt most of my life. I admired Prime Minister Churchill most of my life, and still do, of course. They were great Americans. But they failed, let's face it, they failed miserably in the leadership of our country during a critical time. They could have kept America out of the Second World War. They could have kept England out of the Second World War. They could, with the right mediation, with the right leadership, that war would have been nothing more than a fracas between the Nazis and the communists, and who knows what that would have brought. They may have both failed. We might not have had the evil of communism and Nazism alive today had we had the right leadership back then. During that disastrous Second World War, it involved millions and millions of people. We lost over 1 million people, I think, and Russia lost over 10 million citizens. Not the leadership, of course, but the citizens. The citizens always take the brunt of these wars. All of those people were lost. Their lives were shattered. Their families were shattered for generations. It is reported that the U.S. lost 420,000 lives in the Second World War. I didn't have that number a minute ago, but now I see it on my notes. 420,000 Americans lost. And what did we accomplish in that Second World War? We're a weaker nation than we were before the Second World War. We're a more nation under the control of totalitarian forces now than ever before. What did we accomplish in that Second World War? But Switzerland didn't get in the Second World War. They were neutral. They stayed out of it. They didn't lose a soul in the Second World War. They didn't lose any of their treasure. They were too independent and too smart and too wise to get involved in the Second World War. We were 4,000 miles away from Europe. We got involved. Switzerland was right in the middle of it, and they did not get involved. They stayed out of it. We've had some great presidents throughout our history, and during these perilous times, we can look back and we can see what President Kennedy and Nixon tried to do for our country. They were both in the Second World War. They both fought in the Second World War. They both suffered in the Second World War. And they were against war. Both of them had a policy of getting the United States uninvolved in war. Kennedy had pressure all around him to get involved in the Cuban War and the European War and other wars, and he fought against that. The military-industrial complex had more power than he did, and we know what happened to President Kennedy. He was murdered. We still don't know who was behind his murder, who was behind his assassination, but we must find that out. I remember where I was. I was at IU in a German class when it was announced that President Kennedy had been killed. In fact, virtually every American alive at that time remembers where he or she was when President Kennedy was killed. Okay. And then when Nixon came into office, he adopted the same policies. He did not want war, and virtually brought the world to world peace during his administration. No, his 1.5 administrations, no president had ever brought the world to so close to world peace than President Nixon. He had all the wars stopped all around the world except for the one in Vietnam. He had that done too, but unfortunately, he had too many people around him that wanted the Vietnam War to continue. And Kissinger would go over to Europe and meet with the Vietnamese and come back in a couple of weeks and say, well, we agreed on the table. We agreed how large the table should be and how many chairs should be set around it. I think we made a lot of progress. No progress was made. Hundreds of American soldiers got killed every week in Vietnam. But finally, it came to a conclusion after Nixon left office, and the dinos and the rhinos who control Congress got the United States in perpetual war from then on. Well, President Trump was elected, and he had followed the same policy, and he worked hard for world peace, and the Abraham Accords was just one set of what he did to bring about world peace in Israel and around the world. He got us out of all the wars that he could. He stamped down wars, and of course, industrial military complex came to the fore again and pushed him out of office. And we know what happened next. We've been in perpetual war ever since. Now look where we're at. We're in the Ukraine-Russian war. NATO, what is NATO doing? They were very successful. They got us into the war. We spent $200 billions of dollars and who knows what else in that war. And there's no end in sight. We hope that Trump can get in and get that war ended and go about getting world peace again. Well, we know what our problem is. We've got to get our nation back like it was before President Wilson became president. We've got to reestablish our sovereignty, our independence, our liberty. We've got to again set an example for peace and prosperity, for life and liberty in the world. That was our mission in this world, was to set an example for us. God blessed us to do that, and we successfully did that through President Wilson being elected. From then we've declined undoubtedly, and we need to restore that.